Her hand tightened around the tray. Tight enough that her nails cut into her palm, and she never noticed. The man was twice her size. He took hold of her collar. Gave it one hard pull. The old stitching at her shoulder gave way. The sound of tearing fabric was small, but every soul in that saloon heard it. Bare skin caught the lamplight. And a scar. Not the kind you get from brambles or a careless kitchen knife. A long, pale line, puckered at the edges, silvered by years. The kind only a bullet leaves behind. The room went dead quiet. Not the ordinary lull between piano songs. This was the quiet of men remembering something they'd spent a decade trying to forget. At the back, an old man in a gray coat was holding a glass of whiskey halfway to his mouth. His hand began to shake. The glass slipped from his fingers. It hit the floor. It didn't break. It only rolled. The lamp above the bar was swinging. Just slightly. Just enough. Because somebody had slammed the door too hard coming in, and the wind off the prairie followed him inside like it wanted to see too. Like even the weather in this town had learned to be nosy. Dodge City, Kansas? 1878. A saloon with sawdust floors gone dark in patches, from years of spilled whiskey, and a piano nobody was playing anymore. Because everybody had stopped. Everybody was watching one corner of the room, the way a crowd watches a fight, before the first punch lands, already knowing, already bracing. A girl. 25 years old. Small enough that most men in this town looked past her, without trying, which she'd learned, a long time ago, was its own kind of protection. Tray in one hand. The other hand curled into a fist she didn't remember making, knuckles white, nails cutting little crescents into her palm. And a man twice her size gripping her by the collar. "Give it back," he said. Low. Ugly. The kind of voice that had never once in its life expected to be told no. "Give what back?" Don't what?" That was the thing about her. Even scared, even cornered, she talked back. Because silence had never protected anybody she loved. So why start now? Why start tonight, of all the nights, in front of all these strangers, with her heart already hammering, so hard she could feel it in her teeth? He yanked. Hard. The seam at her shoulder gave way, with a sound like a small tearing sky. Fabric ripping clean along old stitching, thread by thread, and there, just for a second, just long enough, her collarbone. Bare skin catching lamplight. And a scar. Not a pretty one. Not the kind you get from brambles or a careless knife in the kitchen. A long, pale line, puckered at the edges, silvered by years. The kind a bullet leaves when it goes in at an angle and doesn't come out clean. The room went quiet. Not saloon quiet. Not the ordinary lull between piano songs, the kind that fills itself back in within seconds. This was different. This was the quiet of men remembering something they'd spent years trying to forget, the quiet of old ghosts standing up all at once in a crowded room, and nobody willing to say so out loud. Because somewhere near the back, an old man in a gray coat was holding a glass of whiskey halfway to his mouth. And his hand, a hand that hadn't shaken in a decade, not through blizzards, not through burying friends, not through anything the frontier had thrown at him, started shaking now. Visibly. Uncontrollably. The kind of shake a body makes, when the mind has already understood something the mouth hasn't caught up to yet. The glass slipped. It hit the floor and didn't break. Just rolled. Slow half-circle, whiskey pooling dark against the sawdust, stopping against a boot that didn't move to avoid it. Nobody moved to pick it up. The girl yanked her collar back, into place with one hand fast, like closing a door on a room she didn't want anyone looking into. Her eyes found the old man's face across the room, found it before she even meant to look for it, some old animal instinct in her chest doing the searching, before her mind gave permission. And for one heartbeat, just one, something passed between them that had nothing to do with the man still gripping her collar. Something older. Something that had been waiting 8 years to surface, patient as a splinter working its way toward skin. She didn't know his name. Not yet. But something in her chest knew his face. Which was strange. Because she'd never seen him before in her life. Had she? She ran the thought fast, frantic, trying to place him in some ordinary memory, a customer, a passerby, somebody's uncle in town for the cattle sale, and came up with nothing. Nothing ordinary, anyway. Except she had seen him. In dreams she never remembered in the morning, dreams that left her waking, with her heart slamming, and her sheets soaked through. In the shape of a shadow at the edge of a burning barn. In the sound of a voice yelling her name across a field, while the whole world came apart behind her, fire and gunfire, and her father's rifle going silent all at once. The man still holding her collar laughed. Short. Ugly. A laugh with a hook buried somewhere inside it. What? You gonna cry now? No. No? I don't cry for men like you. He shoved her. She stumbled back, into the bar, caught herself on the wood, palms stinging, and for a second the whole saloon held its breath, waiting to see if this was the night somebody finally pulled a gun over a torn shirt and a waitress with too much mouth. Waiting to see if Dodge City was about to earn itself one more story for the newspapers back east, one more grim little legend about how the frontier chews people up and doesn't bother spitting out the bones. It wasn't. Not yet. The man spit near her boots, muttered something about knowing her place, and walked out, into the dark like he owned the street, like the whole town belonged to him, and always had. The doors swung shut behind him. The wind cut off. The lamp stopped swinging. And the saloon exhaled. Conversations picked back up in pieces, awkward, too loud, the way rooms do, when they're trying to convince themselves nothing happened. The piano started again, off-key, hands still shaking on the keys, a tune nobody was really listening to anymore. But the old man in the gray coat didn't move. He just stared at her. Like a man staring at a ghost he'd buried himself. Like a man who'd spent 8 years telling himself a particular lie, and had just watched it collapse in the space of a single torn seam. Her name was Adelaide Doyle. Everybody in Dodge City called her Addie. Nobody called her by her last name, because she'd made sure of that, carefully, deliberately, the way you make sure of anything that could get you killed if it slipped. Because a last name was a thread, and threads could be pulled, and pulled threads led back to places she'd spent 8 years trying to bury, so deep not even her own dreams could find them. She picked her tray back up off the floor, straightened her shoulders, walked toward the back room like nothing had happened at all, chin up, spine straight, every line of her body performing a calm she did not feel even slightly. Except everything had happened. Because the second she was, through that door, out of sight, her hands started shaking exactly the way the old man's had. Exactly? Like some invisible current had run straight through the room, and struck them both the same way, at the same moment, for reasons either of them had said out loud yet. She pressed her back against the wall in the dark little hallway behind the bar, and she breathed. In. Out. Trying to remember the rhythm her father had taught her. Back when breathing was something he still had to teach her. Back before it became the only thing keeping her upright some nights. It didn't work, as well as he'd promised it would. It rarely did anymore. But it was something to do, with her hands besides let them shake. Her fingers went to her collarbone. To the scar under the torn fabric. She didn't need a mirror to know its shape. She traced it 1,000 nights lying awake in a narrow rented bed, back when sleep still came, with pictures she didn't ask for, and didn't know how to stop. That face. That laugh. That voice saying you gonna cry now, like cruelty was just another kind of joke a man could tell at a bar. She knew it. Not from tonight. From before. From a night that had never really ended, not really, just gone quiet and waited. 8 years earlier. The Smoky Hill River country. West of everything that mattered, east of everything that didn't. A stretch of Kansas land, so flat you could watch weather arrive, from 3 days off, if you knew how to read the sky, if somebody had taught you to squint at the horizon, and named the clouds the way other fathers taught their daughters to name flowers. A farmhouse. Small. Whitewashed once, though the paint had mostly given up by then, peeling in long strips, that curled like old skin. A barn leaning a little to the north, the way barns do, after enough winters lean, into whatever direction hurts them least. And out past the fence line, a girl, 17, maybe, standing in the tall grass, with a rifle nearly as long as she was tall, the stock pressed too hard into her shoulder, because she hadn't yet learned to let the weapon do its own work. Elbow down, her father said. It is down. It's up. I can see daylight under it from here. She glared at him. He grinned back, unbothered, the way only fathers can be unbothered by their daughters' glares, like the glare itself was proof he'd raised her right. Sean Doyle. Broad-shouldered, sun-cracked at the eyes, the kind of man who'd worn a badge once down in Texas, and never talked about it, unless he'd had enough whiskey to loosen the years off his tongue, and even then only in pieces, half-sentences that trailed off into the fire instead of finishing themselves. He'd ridden with the Rangers before Kansas. Before the farm. Before her. He stepped behind her. Adjusted her elbow, with 2 fingers, gentle, the way you'd correct a young horse instead of scold it, patient in a way that most men in this county weren't patient about anything. There, he said. Now. Breathe out halfway. Then stop. Why halfway? Because your whole breath, you're moving. No breath at all, you're strangling yourself. Halfway. That's where the world goes still. She fired. The bottle on the fence post exploded into brown glass and morning light, a small violent flash against the pale sky, and for a second the whole world really did seem to go still, exactly like he'd said. Again, he said. And there was something in his voice, pride maybe, or something closer to fear dressed up as pride, like a man who knew exactly how much his daughter would need this skill one day, and hated that he knew it, hated it the way you hate a storm you can see coming, and can't do anything to stop. Which she didn't understand yet. Not then. Because at 17, all she understood was the recoil against her shoulder, and her father's laugh, and the smell of gun oil, and prairie grass, and her mother somewhere behind them on the porch, yelling that breakfast was getting cold, and neither of them cared, not even a little, not with the morning laid out gold, and endless in front of them. Her mother had died when she was 12. Fever, the doctor said, though her father never said the word out loud again, after the funeral, like saying it twice might make it true a second time. Just kept teaching her things a girl wasn't supposed to need to know. How to track a deer through frost. How to reload a Colt, with her eyes closed, fingers finding each chamber by feel alone. How to read a man's hands before his mouth, because hands told the truth first, always, every single time, long before words caught up. Why do I need this? She'd asked once. 14 years old, tired of calluses, tired of her father's silences, tired of being the only girl in the county who knew more about gunpowder than needlework. Because the world doesn't ask permission, he said, before it takes something from you. She hadn't understood that either. Not until the night it took everything. It came at the edge of October. The kind of night where the cold arrives sudden, like it's been waiting behind the hills all along for the right moment to walk in and take what it wanted. She was in the barn, milking, half asleep on her feet, thinking about nothing in particular, a boy from church who'd smiled at her the week before, whether the calf would come early, small ordinary things that belonged to a life she didn't know she was about to lose, when she heard the horses. Not one horse. Many. And not the rhythm of riders passing through, easy and unhurried. The rhythm of riders arriving somewhere they intended to stay. Hooves that meant business. Hooves that meant tonight. Her father's voice cracked through the dark like a whip. Addie. Inside. Now. She didn't move fast enough. Because by the time she reached the barn door, there were torches. 6 of them, maybe 7, riding hard toward the farmhouse, flames streaming sideways in the wind like something alive and hungry, and her father standing on the porch, with a rifle already raised, already yelling words she couldn't fully make sense of, words about deeds, about signatures, about land that wasn't theirs to take, words tangled together, with fear and fury in a way she'd never heard from him before. A man's voice answered from horseback. Flat. Businesslike. Like collecting a debt instead of ending a life. Like the whole thing was a transaction he'd done a dozen times before and expected to do a dozen times again. Last chance, Doyle. Sign it over. Walk away clean. Get off my land. Wrong answer. The first shot came from nowhere she could place. And then everything came apart at once. Gunfire, glass breaking, her father's shape falling backward through the porch rail in a way that didn't look real, didn't look like it belonged to a person she knew, the barn behind her suddenly burning orange at the edges, because somebody had put a torch to the hay, and the whole night had gone the color of a nightmare. She screamed his name. Or thought she did. She could never remember afterward, if sound had actually come out of her, or if it just felt like it had. The memory scrambled the way memories get scrambled by pure animal terror. A hand closed around her arm. Hard. Dragging her sideways, into the dark behind the smokehouse. Don't look, a voice said. Older. Rough. A stranger's voice, urgent in a way that cut straight through her own screaming. Don't you look, girl. Run. My father is gone. Run. She didn't run. Not at first. She fought the hand, clawed at it, until the man, gray-coated even then, though younger, though his hair hadn't gone fully silver yet, pulled her hard enough that her feet left the ground for a second, and something in her simply broke, and let itself be carried, the way a body sometimes has to stop fighting to survive at all. They ran through the tall grass. Through the cold. Through gunfire that chased them for 100 yards, and then, mercifully, didn't, the shots falling away behind them, into the dark like something that had lost interest, or maybe like something that no longer needed to bother. She didn't see her father die. She only heard it. A single shot, distinct from the rest, close range, almost gentle in how final it sounded, a sound so quiet compared to everything around it, that some cruel corner of her mind almost mistook it for nothing at all. And behind them, the farmhouse burned against the dark like something out of a story somebody else's children would be told one day. Not hers. She had no children to tell it to. Not then. Maybe not ever, she thought later, in the years, when hope felt like something she'd used up entirely that night. The stranger pulled her down, into a dry creek bed, and pressed a hand over her mouth, not unkindly, just urgently, the way you'd quiet a child during a thunderstorm, the way you press a hand over a wound to keep the blood in. Not a sound, he whispered. Not one. She bit down on her own scream, until it went somewhere deep and small inside her chest, somewhere it would stay curled up, and waiting for 8 long years, patient as a seed buried too deep for sunlight. That was the night she got the scar. A stray shot, low and wild, catching her collarbone as they ran. She didn't feel it until later. Didn't understand, in the moment, that pain could arrive late to its own party like an uninvited guest that shows up after everyone's already grieving, after the worst of the night has already happened, and there's supposedly nothing left to hurt her. The stranger carried her the last 2 miles. Cleaned the wound, with creek water, and whiskey from a flask he probably needed more than she did. Wrapped it in a strip torn from his own shirt, his hands steadier than they had any right to be, given everything. What's your name? She asked him, hours later, teeth still chattering, though the night wasn't that cold anymore. Or maybe it was. She'd lost the ability to tell temperature from terror. Nathaniel Cross, he said. Friend of your father's. Long time ago. Why'd you save me? He was quiet a long moment. Long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Long enough that the silence itself became its own kind of confession. Because I owed him, he finally said. And because a girl who can shoot a bottle off a fence post at 50 yards shouldn't die in a ditch at 17. You knew that? About the shooting? I knew a lot of things, he said. And something in his voice closed like a door swinging shut, latching, sealing whatever was behind it away for later. Things I should have told your father sooner. She didn't ask what he meant. Not that night. She was too busy trying not to fall apart in front of a stranger, too busy holding herself together, with nothing but sheer stubbornness, and the last of her father's training. But she remembered it. Filed it away the way she filed away everything that hurt too much to look at directly, the way you fold something sharp inside a cloth, and set it on a high shelf, and tell yourself you'll deal with it later. 8 years is a long time to carry a filed-away sentence. 8 years is also, apparently, not long enough to forget it. And now, Dodge City hadn't asked her a single question when she arrived 5 years after that night, 5, not 3, though she'd later catch herself misremembering it as 3, the way trauma sometimes compresses time into shapes that feel truer than the truth, with a new name half borrowed from her mother's side, and a past she kept as tightly wrapped as an old wound. Nobody in a cattle town cares where a hard-working girl comes from. They care whether she can carry 6 plates without dropping one, whether she can smile at drunk cowhands without flinching, whether she shows up on time and doesn't cause trouble. She could do all 3. What she couldn't do, what she'd never quite managed, not in 5 years, was stop watching doors. Every saloon has its rhythms. The morning quiet, dust motes turning slow in the light, through dirty windows, old-timers nursing coffee they never admit they preferred to whiskey. The afternoon lull, regulars nursing one drink for 3 hours, because the alternative is an empty house, and a silence that asks too many questions. And the night crowd, cattlemen fresh off the trail, with pockets full of pay, and appetites for trouble, loud in a way that filled up every corner of a room whether you wanted them to or not. She learned to read every one of them. Which hands were steady. Which eyes lingered too long. Which laughs came a half-second too late, like the man behind them was performing being relaxed instead of actually being relaxed, a performance she recognized, because she gave the same one herself, every single day, for 5 straight years. Because that was the thing nobody warned you about, surviving something like she'd survived. It didn't leave you broken in the ways people expected. It left you sharp. Watchful. A woman who noticed everything, and trusted almost nothing, who could smile, with her whole face, and still be counting exits behind her eyes. She kept a small pistol under her apron. Not for show. Her father's old Colt, cut down and reholstered small enough to hide, and she'd practiced drawing it in the dark of her rented room, until her hands knew the motion better than they knew her own signature, until the weight of it in her palm felt more like home than anything else she owned. Which nobody in Dodge City knew. Nobody guessed that the quiet waitress, with the fast smile and the tired eyes, could put a bullet through a playing card at 30 paces, if her life depended on it. Her life hadn't depended on it. Not in 5 years. Until tonight. She'd seen him come in an hour before the shirt tore. Hadn't recognized him at first, just another cattleman off a trail crew, loud, a little drunk, ordering whiskey like he had somewhere important to be later, and wanted to arrive there numb, the way half the men who came through Dodge City wanted to arrive everywhere. It was the laugh that did it. Short. Ugly. A laugh with a hook in it, the kind that catches somewhere behind your ribs and pulls. She'd heard that laugh once before, 8 years ago, from behind a smokehouse in the dark, while her father lay dying 40 yards away, and a stranger's hand clamped over her mouth to keep her silent. She didn't know the man's name yet. Wouldn't, not until later, when she'd hear it hiss low and furious from Nathaniel Cross's own mouth, Cole Barrow, but she didn't need the name to know the shape of him. The way he tilted his head when he was about to hurt somebody, like he was savoring the anticipation. The particular cruelty in his smile, like cruelty, was just another kind of joke he enjoyed telling. Her hands had started shaking then. Before he ever touched her. Before the collar, before the tearing seam, before the scar saw daylight for the first time in years in front of a room full of strangers, who had no idea what they were witnessing. She told herself to walk away. Go to the back. Wait him out, the way she'd waited out 100 difficult men before him. Except walking away had never been something she was good at. Because when he grabbed a bottle off her tray, that wasn't paid for, and laughed that laugh again, something old and coiled inside her chest simply refused to stay quiet any longer. Something that had been waiting 8 years for exactly this moment, though she hadn't known it, until it was already happening. "That's not yours," she'd said. And the rest, the whole room already knew. Now, in the dark hallway behind the bar, breathing slow, trying to steady hands that didn't want to be steadied, she understood something, with a clarity that felt almost violent. This wasn't coincidence. Men like Cole Barrow didn't wander into cattle towns at random, and happened to sit at the bar of the one saloon, where the last living Doyle poured drinks under a stranger's name. That kind of coincidence didn't exist. Not in her experience. Not anymore. Or maybe it did. Maybe the world really was that cruel, that careless, dropping old ghosts into new rooms, without any plan behind it at all, the universe simply indifferent to the particular geography of her grief. But she didn't believe that. Not anymore. Not since the night she'd watched fire eat a farmhouse, and heard her father's voice go silent mid-sentence. She peeled off her torn shirtwaist, changed into the spare she kept folded in the back for exactly this kind of emergency, spilled drinks, torn hems, the ordinary disasters of saloon work, and caught her own reflection for half a second in the cracked mirror by the storeroom door. Pale. Steady-eyed, despite everything. Her mother's cheekbones, her father's stubborn jaw, the two of them still living somewhere in her face even now, 8 years after the fire took the rest of them away. And underneath the fresh collar, hidden now, the scar that had just told an entire room a story she'd spent 8 years making sure nobody could read. "He's here," she said out loud, to nobody, to the empty storeroom, to the dust, and the crates, and the single guttering lamp. "He's actually here." Which meant the others might be too. Which meant Cross had known something he never told her. Which meant 5 years of careful, quiet, invisible living had just cracked straight down the middle in the space of one torn seam. She thought of Nathaniel's face across the saloon. The dropped glass. The way his eyes had found hers like a man confessing something, without a single word, a confession written entirely in the shape of his shaking hand. He knew. He'd always known more than he'd let on. And tonight, whether he liked it or not, she was finally going to make him say it. She found him 40 minutes later, 3 streets over, in the small rented room above the harness shop, where he'd lived alone, since before she'd arrived in Dodge City. She knew the address, because everyone in town knew it, the quiet old lawman, who kept to himself, who nobody quite dared ask too many questions of, who paid his rent on time, and drank alone, and never once, not in 5 years, had given her a single reason to suspect he'd known her father. Not until tonight. She didn't knock gently. The door opened, before her fist landed a second time. Nathaniel Cross stood in the frame, gray coat gone, shirt sleeves rolled, a lamp burning low behind him. He looked older in his own doorway than he had across a crowded saloon. Older, and tired, and not even a little surprised to see her, like a man who'd been expecting this exact knock for years, and had simply been waiting for the calendar to catch up. "Addie," he said. Don't what? Don't say my name like you've earned the right to it." He stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly. More like a man clearing space for a storm he knew was coming, and had no intention of trying to stop, the way you'd step back from a window before a hailstorm hit the glass. She walked in. Didn't sit. Stood in the middle of the small room, with her arms crossed hard, over her chest, over the collar that hid the scar that had started all of this. "You knew him," she said. "Cole Barrow." Silence. "Say it." "I knew him," Nathaniel said quietly. "You knew he was one of the men who—" "Yes." Just that. One word. No cushioning. No excuse trailing after it to soften the blow, and somehow that honesty was worse than any lie could have been. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. Because some small, stubborn part of her had been hoping, praying, even, though she'd never admit to praying, that she was wrong. That the laugh was a coincidence. That the scar meant nothing to anyone but her, that the whole terrible recognition in the saloon had been nothing but exhaustion and old grief playing tricks. 5 years, she said. 5 years, Nathaniel. You pulled me out of that field. You patched me up. You told me to disappear, and never look back, and I did. I did everything you said, every single thing, and the whole time you knew the man who killed my father was still walking around free? It's not that simple. Then make it simple. He turned away from her. Toward the window, toward the dark street below, toward anywhere that wasn't her face, like a man who couldn't hold both her gaze and the truth at the same time. Cole Barrow was hired, he said. Same as 3 others that night. Hired men. Not the kind who plan things. The kind who show up when somebody else has already decided who's going to die. Then who decided? Silence again. Longer this time. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on a room like weather building, before a storm actually breaks, thick enough you could almost lean against it. Nathaniel. There's things about your father, he said slowly, that I promised him I'd never tell you. Not unless. Unless what? His eyes finally came back to hers. And for the first time in 5 years of knowing this man only, as a quiet stranger at the edge of town, she saw something in his face that looked almost like grief. Or guilt. Or both, tangled together so tightly there was no separating one from the other, 2 vines grown into a single knot. Unless it couldn't be helped anymore, he said. And I think, Addie, I think that time's come tonight. She stood very still. Because 5 years of careful silence, of hidden pistols, and borrowed names, and doors she never stopped watching, had just cracked wide open in one small rented room above a harness shop. Because 8 years of grief had just been handed a shape it never had before, not just tragedy, but conspiracy, not just loss, but something engineered, something planned. And somewhere out past the edge of Dodge City, in the dark, a man who laughed like a hook was probably already asleep, already forgetting the girl whose collar he'd torn, already certain the past stayed buried where he'd left it. He was wrong. She sat down slowly across from Nathaniel Cross, hands finally steady, eyes finally dry, and said the only thing left worth saying. Then tell me everything. Tonight. All of it. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the window glass, carrying with it the first cold breath of a Kansas autumn that had no idea yet how much blood it was about to see before it turned to winter. Which was, she thought, sitting there in the lamplight, with her whole world rearranging itself around one small confession, exactly the way autumn always worked. Beautiful right up until it wasn't. Golden right up until the frost came for everything green. She braced herself and waited for him to begin. The lamp burned low between them, down to its last inch of oil, the flame guttering every time the wind found a gap in the window frame, throwing shadows across the walls that seemed to lean in closer, with every flicker, as if the room itself wanted to hear what came next. Nathaniel Cross didn't start talking right away. He poured 2 glasses of something amber first. Didn't ask if she wanted one. Just set it in front of her the way you'd set down a rope for someone about to climb into a hole either of you could see the bottom of. She didn't touch it. Your father, he said, wasn't just a rancher who got unlucky. I know that. You don't. Not yet. Which stung more than she expected. Because for 8 years she'd built a version of her father in her head, simple, good, murdered for nothing but greed and land, and some small, cowardly part of her didn't want that version disturbed. Didn't want the shape of her grief rearranged one more time. Too late now. He rode with the Rangers in Texas, Nathaniel said. Before Kansas. Before you. You know that part. I know that part. What you don't know is why he left. She waited. Silence had a shape in that room. Heavy. Deliberate. The kind of silence a man builds carefully, brick by brick, before he tears down a wall he's spent years maintaining. There was a case, Nathaniel said, back in Texas. Long before any of this. Land fraud. Forged deeds, false surveys, whole townships signed away to men who never set foot on them. Your father was one of 3 rangers assigned to break it. So he was one of the good ones. He was. Until he found out who was funding it. Her stomach turned. Slow. Cold. Who? Nathaniel didn't answer right away. Which was answer enough, in its own way. Because men only go quiet like that when the name behind the silence is bigger than they're ready to say out loud, when saying it will change the shape of the whole conversation forever. A man with a lot of money, he finally said. And more patience than money. A man who doesn't forget a debt. Doesn't forgive one either. That's not a name, Nathaniel. I know. Then give me one. He looked at her for a long moment. And something passed behind his eyes, calculation, maybe, or fear, or the particular exhaustion of a man deciding whether the truth is a gift or a weapon, and whether he has any right to hand either one to a woman he swore to protect. Not tonight, he said. You promise. I promised I'd tell you everything. I didn't promise it'd all come at once. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice dropping lower, rougher. You go charging at a name, before you understand the shape of the thing behind it, you'll get yourself killed. Same as your father almost did back in Texas, all those years, before Kansas ever came into it. And that was just the first thread. The second one, the one that actually got him killed, that came later. Years later. Here. 2 different things. 2 different crimes, Nathaniel said. Separated by more than a decade. One in Texas, buried and half forgotten. One right here in this county, fresh enough that the blood's barely dried on it. Your father carried proof of the first one for years. Like a stone in his pocket he never quite worked up the nerve to throw. The second one is what finally got him killed. Understand the difference, Addie. Confuse them, and you'll chase the wrong ghost down the wrong road. She sat with that, letting the 2 threads separate themselves in her mind, one old and quiet, one recent and bloody, both leading, somehow, to the same man's door. Fine, she said. Then tell me the shape of it. The one that killed him. The shape of it, according to Nathaniel Cross, was this. Cole Barrow was hired muscle. Nothing more. A man who showed up wherever the money was, did what he was told, and forgot the details the moment the job was done, the way certain men train themselves to forget, because remembering was bad for business, and worse for sleep. He wasn't the one who'd decided her father needed to die. He was simply the one who'd pulled the trigger, that night, alongside 2 others, whose names Nathaniel claimed not to know, or claimed convincingly enough, that she chose to believe him for now, filing the doubt away, with everything else she couldn't afford to deal, within a single sitting. Above them, somewhere, was a structure. An operation. Land being bought up cheap, through intimidation and forged paperwork, all across this stretch of Kansas, in the shadow of a railroad expansion that hadn't been announced yet but was coming. Everyone in Dodge City knew it was coming, the way you know a storm is coming, from the color of the sky even, before the first cloud arrives on the horizon. Whoever controlled the land, before that announcement dropped, controlled everything after. Railroad money, Nathaniel said. That's the shape of it. Somebody's buying up half of western Kansas for pennies before the rest of the world finds out it's about to be worth dollars. And my father found out. Your father found out early. Which made him dangerous. Which made him a problem somebody decided to solve, permanently, the way certain men solve every problem they're patient enough to wait out. She sat with that. Let it settle, into the same place, where she'd been keeping the image of the burning barn, the sound of the single close-range shot, the 8 years of careful, invisible living that had followed. Why didn't you go to the law? She said. Why didn't you tell someone? Why did you just hide me? And nothing else? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Because the law in this part of Kansas. he said. Answers to the same money that killed your father. Which was the kind of sentence that should have shocked her. It didn't. Because some quiet, wounded animal part of her had suspected exactly that for 8 years, and hearing it said out loud didn't break anything new. It just confirmed a fracture that had already been there, waiting, the way a crack in glass doesn't surprise you once you finally see it in the right light. So what do we do? She said. We? You said everything, Nathaniel. Not half. Everything. That means you're in this whether you like it or not. He almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched like it remembered how, a long time ago, before it forgot, before 8 years of guarding a secret had worn the smile clean off his face. Your father used to talk exactly like that, he said. Right before he did something reckless. Good, she said. Then you know what's coming. 3 days later, Dodge City got a new arrival, and Addie almost didn't notice him at all. Which, looking back, was its own kind of mistake. Jesse Hollis came off the afternoon train, with a battered leather satchel, a notebook he seemed physically incapable of putting down, and the restless energy of a man who'd spent too many years in cities, and hadn't yet learned that the frontier moved at its own unhurried pace, that patience out here wasn't a virtue, it was survival. He took a room above the general store. Asked too many questions at the mercantile. Asked even more questions at the saloon, where Addie set a plate of stew in front of him, and immediately regretted making eye contact. You're the waitress, he said. Not a question. More like a man confirming a fact he already suspected, already filed away for some later use. I'm the one holding the stew. Right. Sorry. He had the decency to look embarrassed. Jesse Hollis. I write for papers back east. Chicago, mostly. Sometimes further. Congratulations. I'm working on a story. Everyone's working on something. He didn't take the hint. Which, again, looking back, should have told her something about the kind of man he was, the kind who didn't take hints, who kept digging even when the ground clearly didn't want to be dug, who mistook every closed door for a puzzle instead of a warning. Land, he said. Specifically, land changing hands out here faster than it should be. Small operations. Family plots. All going cheap, all going quiet, right before. He lowered his voice, glanced around the room like a man checking for eavesdroppers even, though nobody was listening. Right before the railroad makes its announcement. Her whole body went still. She hoped it didn't show. That's not really my business, she said, setting the stew down harder than necessary, the plate rattling against the table. No, Jessie said, watching her face a beat too long. I didn't think it would be. Which was the exact wrong thing to say to a woman who'd spent 8 years training herself to read the difference between a stranger, who suspected nothing, and a stranger, who suspected everything. She walked away, before he could ask another question. But that night, lying awake in her narrow rented bed, staring at a ceiling she'd memorized crack by crack, she found herself turning his words over like a stone in her palm. Land changing hands? Cheap. Quiet. Right before the announcement. Exactly what Nathaniel had described. Which meant one of two things. Either Jesse Hollis was exactly what he claimed to be, a reporter chasing a story that happened to intersect with hers by pure, terrible coincidence. Or he already knew more than he was letting on, and the questions at her table hadn't been idle curiosity at all, but something closer to a test. She didn't sleep much that night. She brought it to Nathaniel the next morning, in the back room of the harness shop, over coffee too bitter to be enjoyed, and too necessary to refuse. There's a reporter in town, she said, asking about the land sales. Nathaniel's face didn't change. Which, for a man as guarded as him, was itself a kind of answer. You know him, she said. I know of him. Nathaniel. He's written about railroad corruption before. Kansas City. Topeka. Got run out of one town on a rail, almost literally, for asking the wrong banker the wrong question at the wrong dinner party. He sipped his coffee. Made a face like it had personally wronged him. If he's here, it's not coincidence. So he's an ally. Or bait. She hadn't considered that. Should have. Because after everything, after 8 years of watching doors, after learning her father's death wasn't the simple tragedy she told herself it was, she should have known better than to assume anything walked into her life by accident anymore. So what do? We watch him, Nathaniel said. Before we trust him. Watching Jesse Hollis turned out to be easier than expected, mostly because Jesse Hollis was terrible at not being watched. He asked questions at the land office. He asked questions at the bank. He asked questions of an elderly widow, whose family plot had sold 3 months earlier for a fraction of its worth, and the widow, flattered by the attention of a young man, from a Chicago paper, told him everything, including things she probably shouldn't have, her voice carrying clean across the porch, where Addie sat, ostensibly minding her own business 2 houses down. Addie followed him at a careful distance for 2 days, learning his patterns the way she'd once learned to track deer through frost. Where he ate. Who he talked to. The particular way he chewed the end of his pencil, when he was thinking hard about something that didn't add up, brow furrowed like the numbers themselves had personally offended him. By the 3rd day, she was fairly certain of one thing. He wasn't working for anyone. Not Voss, not the railroad, not any of the shadows Nathaniel had described. He was exactly what he claimed to be, stubborn, reckless, chasing a story, with the kind of hunger that came from believing, foolishly or not, that the truth still mattered to somebody, that the truth was worth the risk of a bullet in a strange town. Which made him useful. Which also made him dangerous, in a different way than she'd first feared. Because a man like that didn't know when to stop digging, and men who didn't know when to stop digging had a way of digging their own graves right alongside everyone else's. She approached him on the 4th day. Outside the general store, in full daylight, where anyone watching would see nothing but a waitress exchanging pleasantries with a newcomer. "You're asking a lot of questions," she said quietly. "Occupational habit. You're going to get somebody hurt." That got his attention. He set down the crate he'd been half lifting onto the store's porch, and looked at her properly for the first time, not as a waitress, not as a source, but as someone who might actually know something. "Somebody already got hurt," he said. "That's why I'm here." "What do you mean?" "The widow Hargrove. 3 months back. Her husband died the same week their land sold." His voice dropped, careful, measured. "Officially, heart failure. Unofficially, the doctor, who signed the certificate, left town 2 weeks later. Didn't tell anyone where he was going." The words landed in her chest like a struck match. Because that was exactly the pattern. Exactly the shape Nathaniel had described, only playing out again, years later, to a different family, with a different name, the same machinery grinding forward, without pause, without conscience. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Not here." "Where?" "Tonight. The harness shop, above the store on 3rd. After dark." He studied her a moment longer than was comfortable. "You're not just a waitress," he said. "No," she said. "I'm really not." That night, in Nathaniel's small room above the harness shop, 3 people sat around the table, that had suddenly become far too small for the weight of what was being placed on it. Jesse laid out his notebook, pages dense with names, dates, dollar amounts too small to be honest. 6 families, he said. In the last 18 months. All sold land bordering the same stretch, this stretch, right here. He tapped a rough map he'd sketched himself. At prices no honest buyer would offer. Every single sale went through the same office. Voss Land and Trust, Nathaniel said quietly. Addie's head snapped toward him. You know the name. I've always known the name, Nathaniel said. And something in his voice, in the way he said it, made the small room feel suddenly colder, like a draft had found its way in, through a crack nobody had noticed before. Harlan Voss. Banker. Land broker. Man with more polish than a Sunday church pew, and a reputation nobody in this town dares question out loud. You said before you didn't know who was behind it. I said I wasn't ready to say the name. He met her eyes. There's a difference. She wanted to be angry. Found instead that she was mostly just tired, the particular exhaustion of learning, again and again, that everyone around her had been carrying pieces of the truth in careful, separate pockets, doling them out only when they judged her ready. She was so tired of people deciding when she was ready. Tell me about him, she said. All of it. Now. No more pieces. Nathaniel exhaled. Long, slow. The sound of a man finally letting go of a weight he'd carried further than he meant to. Harlan Voss came out here, from back east 30 years ago, he said. Same time as a lot of men chasing opportunity. Except Voss wasn't chasing opportunity. He was chasing your mother. The room went very still. What? Addie said. Your mother. Before she married your father. Voss courted her for the better part of a year. Everybody in the county thought it was settled, that she'd marry, into money, into comfort, into a life a lot easier than the one she chose instead. She chose my father. She chose your father, Nathaniel confirmed. And Voss never forgave either one of them for it. Jessie had stopped writing. Sat very still, watching the two of them, with the careful attention of a man realizing his newspaper story had just become something far more personal than he'd bargained for, something he wasn't entirely sure he had the right to keep writing down. 30 years? Addie said, almost to herself. He's been carrying this for 30 years? Men like Voss don't let go of things, Nathaniel said. They just wait. Patiently. Until the world hands them a reason to collect. And the railroad was his reason. The railroad was his opportunity, Nathaniel said. The land was his method. But you, your family, I think you were always going to be part of the price. One way or another. Whether the railroad ever came through or not. She sat with that. Let it settle into her bones alongside everything else she'd learned in the last 4 days. The old Texas case, a stone in her father's pocket for years. The new Kansas scheme, the one that had actually pulled the trigger. And underneath both of them, threading through 30 years like a root system nobody had ever bothered to dig up, one man's wounded pride. Which was too much. Which was, frankly, more truth than any one person should be asked to carry in the space of a single week. Except there was no version of this, where she got to set it back down. So what do we do? She said for the second time in 4 days, the question becoming something like a mantra, a small stubborn prayer she kept repeating, because she didn't yet have an answer worth trusting. Jessie cleared his throat. We need proof. Documents. Something that ties Voss directly to the forged deeds, not just the pattern of who benefited. And where would that proof be? Addie asked. His office, Nathaniel said grimly. Or his home. Men like Voss don't trust banks with their real secrets. They keep them close. Locked. Personal. Then we get inside. Addie. Don't, she said. Don't tell me it's too dangerous. Don't tell me to wait, to be patient, to let the men handle it. I've been patient for 8 years, Nathaniel. 8 years of waiting for someone else to decide I was ready for the truth. I'm done waiting. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. And something in his expression shifted, not quite approval, not quite fear, but something adjacent to both, the particular look of a man watching a young woman become, right in front of him, exactly the person her father had always been afraid she'd have to become. Your father, he said quietly, would have said the exact same thing. Good, she said. Then help me do this right. The plan, when it finally came together, over 3 more nights of careful, whispered strategy, was simple in outline, and treacherous in every detail. Voss kept a private study in his home on the edge of town, a house too large for one man, built with money that had never once had to explain itself. Every Thursday evening, he dined at the same restaurant, with the same circle of businessmen, A ritual so fixed that Jessie had confirmed it 3 weeks running, without Voss ever varying the pattern by so much as an hour, the kind of routine only a man who believed himself untouchable could afford to keep. 3 hours. That was the window. Enough time, Nathaniel calculated, to get in, through the servants' entrance at the rear, find the study, locate whatever ledgers or correspondence might exist, and get out again, before anyone noticed. Addie would go in. Small enough to move quietly, steady enough not to panic if something went wrong. Jessie would wait 2 streets over with a horse and cart, ready to move fast if they needed to disappear. Nathaniel would watch the restaurant. Watch Voss. Send word the moment the dinner ended early, if it ended early, if anything at all deviated from the pattern they'd so carefully mapped. If something goes wrong, Nathaniel told her, the night before, gripping her shoulder, with a hand that hadn't stopped shaking a little since the night in the saloon. You run. You don't fight. You don't try to be clever. You run. I know how to run. I know you do, he said. I taught myself that lesson watching you do it once already. I don't want to watch it twice. She almost softened at that. Almost let herself feel, for just a moment, the particular ache of being cared for by someone who carried her guilt for 8 long years, who had spent a decade watching over her from a careful, sorrowful distance. Almost. Because there wasn't room for softness. Not yet. Not until this was finished. Thursday came the way Thursdays do, slow at first, then suddenly, terribly fast, the way time behaves right before something irreversible. She wore dark clothes. Borrowed boots, quieter than her own. Her father's cut-down coat strapped beneath her jacket, though she prayed, genuinely prayed, that she wouldn't need it. The servants' entrance was exactly where Jessie's careful scouting had promised it would be. Unlocked, or nearly so, a simple latch that gave way to a hairpin in under a minute, a skill she'd learned from Nathaniel 2 nights earlier, in a lesson that had felt more like inheritance than instruction. Inside, the house was dark and enormous and smelled faintly of cigar smoke and money. She moved through it like a held breath. Which was fitting, because she was, in fact, holding her breath, counting her steps instead of counting her seconds, because counting steps kept the panic further away than counting seconds did, gave her hands and her mind something small and manageable to do, while the rest of her screamed to turn back. The study was exactly where Nathaniel had described. Heavy door. Locked, of course, though the hairpin trick worked here too, her hands steadier than she'd expected them to be. Inside, a desk the size of a small boat. Shelves of ledgers. A safe in the corner that she had no hope of opening, and hadn't planned to try. She went straight for the desk. Top drawer. Locked. Second drawer. Locked. Third. Unlocked. Papers. Correspondence. Names she recognized from Jessie's notebook. The Hargrove family, 3 others, each with dollar figures scrawled beside them, that made her stomach turn. And beneath them, folded twice, brittle with age in a way the others weren't. A deed. Her family's land. Her father's signature at the bottom, except it wasn't her father's signature. Clothes. Clothes enough to fool a careless eye. But she'd watched that man sign his name 1,000 times across 1,000 ordinary documents, and this wasn't it. The loop on the D was wrong. The slant leaned the opposite direction. Forged. Proof. Actual proof. Her hands shook as she folded it small enough to slip inside her jacket. And that was when she heard the front door. Which shouldn't have happened. Not for another hour, according to every careful calculation they'd made, according to 3 weeks of Jessie's patient, meticulous watching. Voices in the hallway. 2 of them. One she didn't recognize. The other, unmistakably, Harlan Voss. Her heart didn't just skip. It seized, entirely, for one long, terrible second, before slamming back into rhythm at twice its normal speed. She had maybe 10 seconds before those footsteps reached the study door. She looked at the window. Second floor drop, too high to risk cleanly, too loud even if she tried. She looked at the heavy curtains flanking the far wall. Not ideal. Not even close to ideal. But it was what she had. She slipped behind them just as the door opened, pressing herself flat against cold glass, breath held so tight her lungs burned, with the effort of staying silent. "Don't care what the reporter's asking," Voss was saying, his voice smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life been genuinely afraid. "Let him ask. Let him dig. There's nothing here for him to find." Which was, of course, precisely the moment Addie realized the deed folded against her ribs was the loudest thing in the entire room. The second voice, younger, rougher, familiar in a way that made her blood run cold, answered. "He's been talking to the waitress. The one at the saloon." "Cole Barrow." "The waitress," Voss repeated, and there was something in his tone now, something curious, almost amused. "The one whose shirt you tore." "Wasn't my intention to." "I don't care about your intentions, Mr. Barrow. I care about the fact that you drew attention to a woman who, until recently, had been remarkably good at staying invisible." A pause. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crossing the study floor. "What was her name again?" "Doyle," Cole said. "Goes by Addie now." "Used to be." "I know who she used to be," Voss said. And his voice had changed now, dropped into something quieter, something almost tender in the way certain kinds of cruelty can sound tender, when they've had 30 years to perfect it. "I've known who she was since the day she walked into this town." Addie's blood went to ice. He'd known. This whole time. 5 years of careful invisibility, of borrowed names, and watched doors, and he'd known exactly who she was, probably from the very first week. "Why haven't you?" Cole started. "Because there was no reason to," Voss said. "A ghost causes no trouble, as long as she stays a ghost. But a ghost who starts asking questions," his voice sharpened, just slightly, just enough. "That's a different matter entirely." Footsteps, approaching the desk now. Close enough that Addie could hear the particular creak of the chair, as Voss settled into it. Close enough that if he glanced left, if he so much as turned his head 3 degrees toward the window. He didn't find the reporter, Voss said. Find out exactly what he knows, and who he's told. And Mr. Barrow, find out who's been helping our Miss Doyle stay so remarkably well informed all of a sudden. Because 5 years of silence doesn't just break on its own. You think somebody's talking to her. I think, Voss said slowly, that ghosts don't dig up their own graves without somebody handing them a shovel. I'll put a man on the reporter tonight, Cole said. There's a boy runs errands for half the town. Been useful before. Use him, Voss said. And Barrow, quietly. I don't want this getting loud, before I'm ready for it to. Silence then. Long enough that Addie's lungs began to genuinely ache, held breath turning to fire in her chest. Until, finally, mercifully, the 2 men left the study, the door clicking shut behind them, their footsteps fading down the hall, and then, at last, out the front door entirely. She counted to 60 before she moved. Then counted to 60 again, just to be sure. She got out the way she came in, servant's entrance, dark yard, the borrowed quiet boots making almost no sound against the packed dirt. Jesse was waiting exactly where he'd promised, cart and horse tucked into the shadow of an alley 2 streets over, his face tight, with worry that broke into visible relief the moment he saw her emerge from the dark. You're late, he said. I was about to. He knows, she said, climbing up beside him, voice shaking now that there was finally room for it to shake. Voss. He's known who I am since I got to town. Jesse's face went pale. That's not possible. We were careful. Nathaniel was careful, you were. He knows, Jesse. And he's put a man watching your reporting too. Somebody with a boy who runs errands. Cole's using him to track us both. The cart lurched into motion, wheels rattling over the uneven street, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the weight of what she'd overheard settling over both of them like a physical thing. "There's more," she said finally. "He gave Barrow instructions tonight. Said to find out who's been helping me. Said to do it quiet, before it gets loud." Jessie's jaw tightened. "Then we need to warn Nathaniel. Now. He's still watching the restaurant, waiting for our signal." They found Nathaniel exactly where he was supposed to be, a shadowed doorway across from the restaurant, watching the entrance, waiting for a signal that never should have needed sending, because the dinner should never have ended early. Except when they reached him, something was already wrong. He was slumped against the doorframe. One hand pressed hard against his side, dark and wet in the lamplight, his breathing shallow, and fast in a way that made Addie's whole body go cold with recognition. "Nathaniel! I'm fine," he said, which was, transparently, a lie. "You're not fine, you're ambush," he managed. "Two men. Waiting when I stepped out to send word the dinner broke early." He grimaced, pressing harder against the wound. "Should have known. Cole's had eyes on this street for longer than tonight. I just didn't want to believe it." The words hit her like ice water. Because now, at least, the puzzle had an edge to hold on to. Cole hadn't needed Jessie's careless slip, hadn't needed any leak from inside their small circle at all. He'd simply been watching this street, this doorway, this pattern, the same patient way he'd been watching everything else, the same way Voss had been watching her for 5 long years. She looked at Jessie. And Jessie, pale, shaking, looked back at her, with an expression somewhere between relief and horror. Relief that the blame hadn't landed on him, after all, horror at how close they'd all come to a very different ending. "It wasn't either of us," Jessie said quietly. "It was never either of us. He's just that thorough." Nathaniel groaned, sliding further down against the doorframe, and whatever fear had been building in Addie's throat had to wait, had to be swallowed whole, and set aside, because a man was bleeding in front of her, and there wasn't time left for anything except getting him somewhere safe. They half carried, half dragged him to the cart. Jessie drove faster than was wise through the dark streets, wheels catching every rut, Nathaniel's breathing growing thinner with every jolt. "Stay with me," Addie said, pressing both hands hard against the wound, the way her father had once shown her to press against a hurt animal's leg to slow the bleeding. "Stay with me, Nathaniel, don't you dare." "Bossy," he managed through gritted teeth. "Just like your father." "Good," she said, voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady. "Then you know I won't let you quit on me." They got him to the doctor's house on the far edge of town, an old woman named Greaves, who asked no questions, and had, apparently, patched up worse in her time, though she muttered the whole time about idiots, who got themselves shot on a Thursday night in a town, where nothing interesting happened, until suddenly, all at once, everything did. Addie sat outside the room for 2 hours. Didn't speak much. Barely moved. Jessie sat across from her, notebook closed for once, hands folded so tight his knuckles had gone white. "For what it's worth," he said eventually, "I'm glad it wasn't me. And I'm sorry I ever gave you a reason to think it might be." "You didn't," she said. And meant it mostly, the last of her suspicion finally draining out of her now that the truth had a proper shape. "Cole's been watching this town longer than either of us guessed. Longer than you've even been here." The door to the doctor's room opened. Old Mrs. Greaves stepped out, wiping her hands on a bloodied apron, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "He'll live," she said. "Bullet went through clean. Missed everything that matters, if such a thing exists in a man, that old, and that stubborn." She fixed Addie with a hard look. "But he needs rest. Real rest. Not whatever it is you two are dragging him into." Relief hit Addie, so hard her knees nearly buckled. She sat down heavily on the bench outside the door. Pressed both hands against her face. Because underneath the relief, something colder was settling in. Something that had been circling the edges of her thoughts ever since Voss's voice in that study said the words a ghost, who starts asking questions. He'd known she was in the house tonight. Or close enough to knowing. Close enough that Cole Barrow had been sent looking for whoever was helping her, before she'd even made it out the servant's door. The proof was still folded against her ribs, the forged deed, real, solid, evidence enough to matter, if it ever reached the right hands. But sitting there in the dark hallway outside Nathaniel's sick room, she understood with sudden, sickening clarity that the deed wasn't the only thing that had gotten out of that house tonight. A warning had gotten out too. Or rather, a warning had already been building, patient and quiet, for a full year, before tonight, and tonight had simply been the moment it finally spoke. Which meant the fight she thought was about to begin, Voss, the deed, the long overdue reckoning for her father's murder, had already, quietly, begun without her. And somewhere out in the dark streets of Dodge City, someone who had been watching her for far longer than she'd ever suspected was still out there. Still patient. Still certain, in that particular way powerful men are certain, that the story would end however he decided it should. She intended to prove him wrong. Morning came gray over Dodge City. No sunrise to speak of, just the sky lightening, from black to iron, the way it does in Kansas, when autumn finally decides winter's not far behind. Addie hadn't slept. She'd sat outside Nathaniel's sick room, until dawn, watching his chest rise and fall through the cracked door, counting his breaths the way her father had once taught her to count her own. In. Out. Steady enough. Not steady enough to stop her from checking every 20 minutes like a woman checking a stove she was terrified had been left burning. Jesse had gone home sometime past midnight. She hadn't stopped him. Hadn't said much of anything to him at all, actually, beyond a clipped goodnight that carried more weight than either of them wanted to name out loud. Nathaniel stirred around 7. Groggy. Pale. Alive, which was the only part that mattered. "You look terrible," he rasped. "You know. You've got a mirror's worth of terrible sewn into your side. Charming as ever. Learned it from somewhere." He almost smiled. Almost. Winced instead, pressing a hand flat against the bandages Mrs. Greaves had wrapped tight around his ribs. "Don't move," Addie said. "Wasn't planning to. You're always planning something. That's how you ended up shot." He didn't argue that one. Which told her more than any answer could have. She pulled a chair close to the bed. Saturday. Folded her hands in her lap the way her mother used to, back before fever took her. Back before any of this began. "I need to ask you something," she said. "About my father. About Texas." "Ask." "You said there were two things. An old case and a new one. The old one gave him something to hold over Voss. The new one is what got him killed. I need to understand both of them clearly. All the way through. No more pieces handed to me one at a time." Nathaniel was quiet a moment. Considering. The way he considered everything, slow and careful, like a man who learned the hard way what happened when you moved too fast on incomplete information. "All right," he said finally. "Then let's finish it properly. Both threads. Start to end." The mercantile was busy that morning. Wagons in from outlying farms, cattle drovers stocking up, before the next drive south. The ordinary chaos of a cattle town going about its ordinary business while, underneath all of it, something far less ordinary was quietly coming apart at the seams. Addie moved through the crowd carefully. Watching faces. The way she'd watched faces for 5 straight years, without ever quite admitting to herself how tired that kind of watching made her. She found who she was looking for near the feed sacks. A boy, maybe 15, who ran errands for half the businesses in town, and saw more than anyone gave him credit for, because nobody credits boys that age with seeing anything at all. "Tommy!" He startled. Guilty, almost, though she hadn't accused him of anything yet. "Miss Addie. You run messages for the saloon sometimes. And the bank. And Mr. Voss's office, don't you?" "Sometimes." "Yes, ma'am." "Anybody asked you to carry a message about me? Ever?" Where I go. Who I talk to. What I do on my days off. His face did something complicated. Fear, mostly, chased fast by the particular guilt of a boy who'd taken money for something he never fully understood the weight of. I didn't know it was bad, he said quickly. I swear I didn't. He just paid good. Real good. Said he was worried about you is all. Said your kin used to know him, wanted to make sure you were doing all right out here on your own. Her heart went very still. Who, Tommy? Mr. Barrow. The boy said. Cole Barrow. Been paying me near a year now. Just to say where you went. Who you talked to. And lately, this last week, where the old lawman goes at night too. Which streets. Which doorways he watches from. There it was. The last piece finally settling into place, confirming what Nathaniel had already half suspected in his sickbed. Not a leak, from inside their small circle at all. Just patient, methodical surveillance, running for a year, aimed first at her, then widened to include Nathaniel the moment Cole noticed the two of them meeting. A year. Not 3 weeks, since Barrow strolled into town and tore her shirt in front of a room full of strangers. A year. Thank you, Tommy, she managed, though the words came out thinner than she meant them to. You're not in trouble. Not with me. But you're going to stop taking his money, starting today. Yes, ma'am. I promise. She walked out of the mercantile, into the gray morning light, and for the first time, since the night her shirt tore, she understood the full shape of what she was facing. Not a spontaneous grudge. Not bad luck colliding accidentally with old wounds. Not a betrayal, from inside her own small, fragile circle of trust. A year of surveillance. A year of Voss watching her, from a comfortable distance, deciding when, not if, but when, to finally collect on a debt he believed the world owed him. She thought she had time. She was wrong. She found Jesse at the telegraph office, sending word to his paper back east, and the sight of him, hunched over the counter, ink-stained fingers, that same restless energy that had first made her suspicious of him, softened something in her chest she hadn't expected to soften. I found out who's been watching us, she said. It was never you. I know, he said quietly. Nathaniel told me this morning, before I left. A boy running errands. Paid by Barrow for the better part of a year. You're not angry I suspected you. I'd have suspected me too, he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, something that made the last of her guardedness toward him quietly loosen. Whatever you're about to do next, I want in. All the way in. She almost argued. Almost told him to go home, to leave this to people who'd already lost too much to walk away now. Except she remembered, with sudden clarity, telling Nathaniel almost the exact same thing days earlier. I'm done waiting. I'm done letting people decide when I'm ready. She couldn't very well deny Jesse the same choice. All right, she said. Then let's finish this properly. They gathered that evening in Nathaniel's sick room, the old lawman propped up against pillows, pale but stubborn, refusing every suggestion that he rest instead of plan. The deed's real, Jesse said, spreading the forged document across the blanket. I've seen enough forged paperwork in my career to know a bad signature, when it's staring me in the face. This proves fraud. But fraud alone won't hang a man like Voss. Not in a county, where half the judges owe him favors. Then what will? Addie asked. Confession, Nathaniel said. Or a witness willing to testify against him in front of people who can't be bought. Cole, Addie said slowly. Cole's a hired gun, Nathaniel said. Men like that don't testify. They run. Or they die quiet, before they ever get the chance to talk. Then we need something bigger, Jesse said. Something that ties Voss directly to your father's murder. Not just the land fraud, the killing itself. Silence settled over the room. Heavy. The particular silence of 3 people staring at the same impossible mountain, from 3 different angles, none of them seeing a clear path up. Until Nathaniel spoke again, voice quiet, reluctant, like a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried far longer than his body could bear. "There's something I never told you," he said to Addie. "The old case. From Texas. I said before it gave your father leverage. Now I'll tell you what it actually was." Her stomach tightened. "Tell me. Voss didn't just lose your mother to your father," Nathaniel said slowly. "There was a scandal before that. Years earlier back east, before he ever came to Kansas, or Texas at all. A business partner, who died under circumstances nobody ever fully explained. Money that disappeared right before the man's death, and reappeared, conveniently, in Voss's accounts right after. You're saying he killed someone before all of this. I'm saying your father found proof of it," Nathaniel said. Years later, during the Texas investigation, when he was digging into an entirely different fraud, and stumbled onto the old scandal by accident. Documents. A letter from the dead man's widow, suspicious of the timing, suspicious of Voss's sudden wealth. Your father kept it. For years. As insurance, maybe. Or because he never quite trusted himself to use it, and ruin a man's life on old suspicion alone. Where is it now? I don't know, Nathaniel admitted. He never told me exactly where he hid it. Only that it existed. Only that if anything ever happened to him, I should look after you first, and worry about justice second. Addie sat with that, the weight of it settling slow and heavy across her shoulders. Her father hadn't just been an innocent man caught between greedy predators and a hungry railroad. He'd been carrying a weapon of his own, all along, from a different fight entirely, a fight that had happened years before Kansas, years before her. A weapon he'd never used. A weapon that had, perhaps, gotten him killed precisely because Voss could never be sure whether or when he might finally decide to use it. If that letter still exists, Jessie said slowly, it's the missing piece. Motive from 30 years back. Pattern. Proof he's done this before and gotten away with it, long before Kansas land or your father ever entered the picture. And if Voss already found it and destroyed it, Nathaniel said, then we've got nothing but a forged deed and a dead man's word against a living one. Then we need to find out which, Addie said, before he finds us first. They didn't get the chance to search calmly. Because 2 nights later, in the deep hour, before dawn, Dodge City's sleepy quiet shattered into something else entirely. Addie woke to the sound of glass breaking somewhere below her rented room. Not loud. Careful, almost the particular, controlled break of someone trying not to wake a household, and failing anyway, because old floorboards have a way of betraying even the most careful intruder. Her hand found her father's Colt, before her mind had even fully caught up to what was happening. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow. Deliberate. She pressed herself flat against the wall beside her door, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and thought, absurdly, uselessly, the way the mind does strange things under pressure, of her father's voice in the tall grass 8 years earlier. Elbow down. Breathe out halfway. Then stop. The door handle turned. She fired the moment it opened, aiming low, aiming to wound rather than kill, some old instinct refusing to let her end a life, before she even knew whose life it was. A man's scream. A body hitting the floor. And through the doorway, in the dim light of a single hallway lamp, 3 more men behind him, weapons already raised. She didn't wait to count them properly. She dove sideways through her window, glass biting at her arms, landing hard in the alley below in a roll her father had drilled into her 100 times across 100 practice falls in soft prairie grass, back when she was 17, and thought this kind of training was just another chore to complain about. She didn't complain about it now. Gunfire chased her down the alley, splintering wood, sparking off stone, and she ran the way Nathaniel had taught her to run 8 years ago behind a burning farmhouse, not fast in a straight line, but low and unpredictable, and always toward cover. She made it 3 streets before the shooting stopped. Or before she stopped hearing it, at least, her ears ringing too loud to be certain of anything. She found Jesse's rented room by memory alone, pounding on the door, until he opened it bleary-eyed, and the sight of her, hair wild, arms bleeding, breath coming in ragged gasps, snapped him fully awake in an instant. "They found me," she managed. "They found my room." "Who?" "Voss's men." "Has to be Nathaniel." They ran together to the harness shop, and Addie's heart stopped entirely for one long, terrible second at the sight of the door standing open, dark inside, silent in a way that felt wrong. Until a voice, rough and pained, but unmistakably alive, called out from the shadows. "Addie! That you?" Relief hit her, so hard her knees nearly buckled. Nathaniel sat propped against the wall inside, pistol still gripped in one hand, a second body on the floor a few feet away, one of Voss's men, unmoving, sent to finish what the fire 8 years ago had failed to finish, and instead finding a wounded old lawman, who still, apparently, knew exactly how to defend himself. "You're hurt," Addie said, rushing to his side. "Already was," Nathaniel said grimly. "This just added insult to it. How many came for you?" "2. One's not getting up again. The other ran, when I put a bullet through his shoulder." He winced, pressing a hand against his ribs. "They're not being subtle anymore, Addie. Which means Voss has decided waiting isn't worth it. Because he knows we found the deed. Because he knows you're not a ghost anymore," Nathaniel said. "Ghosts don't dig. Ghosts don't ask questions. He's decided you've become a problem he can't afford to wait out any longer." Jesse knelt beside them, checking Nathaniel's wound, with hands that had clearly done this before somewhere, sometime, in a life he'd never fully explained. "We can't stay in town. Not tonight. Not with men actively hunting all 3 of us." "Then where?" Addie asked. Nathaniel was quiet a moment, considering. And when he finally spoke, there was something old and heavy in his voice, the sound of a man returning, at last, to a place he'd spent years avoiding. "Your family's land," he said. "What's left of it. Nobody's touched it since the fire. Nobody wants cursed ground, not even men greedy enough to want everything else. You want to go back there. I want to survive the night," Nathaniel said. "And I want to find whatever your father hid, if it's still there to find. Because I have a feeling, Addie, that if that letter exists anywhere at all, it exists somewhere only your father would have thought to hide it. Somewhere that means something. Somewhere that's only ever belonged to your family." She sat with that. The idea of returning to the place, where everything had ended, the burned farmhouse, the tall grass, the creek bed, where she'd first learned what it felt like to have a bullet enter your body, without your permission, settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Except there was no version of this left, where she got to avoid it forever. "All right," she said. "Then we go home." They left before dawn, Nathaniel too weak to ride fast, but too stubborn to be left behind, propped in the back of a borrowed wagon, with a rifle across his lap, and a grim, determined look on his face, that reminded Addie, painfully, of every time her father had insisted he was fine, when he clearly wasn't. The ride took most of the day. West then north, along roads that grew rougher and lonelier the further they traveled, from Dodge City's noise, until finally the landscape opened into something Addie's body recognized, before her mind fully caught up. The Smoky Hill River country. Flat. Endless. The kind of Kansas land where you could watch weather arrive 3 days off, if you knew how to read the sky. And there, at the top of a gentle rise, the burned skeleton of a farmhouse, that time and weather had worn down further, with every passing year, but never quite finished erasing. Addie's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't been back. Not once. Not in 8 years. "You don't have to do this," Jessie said quietly, watching her face. "Yes," she said. "I do." They approached slowly, the wagon creaking to a stop at the edge of what had once been a fence line, now just scattered posts leaning at odd angles in the tall grass. Addie climbed down, and stood there a long moment, staring at the blackened bones of the house, where she'd learned to shoot, where her mother had called her in for breakfast, where her father had taught her that the world doesn't ask permission before it takes something from you. "The barn," she said finally, voice thick. "He kept things in the barn. A false floor under the tack room. I remember him showing me once, when I was small. Told me every man needs one place nobody else knows about." The barn had survived better than the house, leaning hard to the north, roof half collapsed, but the walls still standing, still sheltering the ghost of everything that had happened here. She found the tack room by memory alone. Found the loose floorboard beneath years of dust and rot, exactly where an 8-year-old memory told her it should be. Her hands shook as she pried it up. Inside, a metal box, rusted but intact. Papers, protected just enough by careful wrapping, that time hadn't destroyed what fire and rain had failed to reach. She lifted them out, with hands that had gone completely, deathly still. A letter. Faded ink, a widow's careful, grieving handwriting, dated some 15 years before the fire that took her family. Accusations laid out plain and clear, money that vanished right before her husband's death, money that reappeared in the accounts of a man named Harlan Voss within weeks. And beneath it, in her father's own handwriting, notes. Dates. A record of everything he'd suspected, everything he'd gathered, everything he'd apparently been building toward using someday, if he ever found the courage, or the necessity, to finally use it. "We found it," she breathed. "Nathaniel, we found it." She turned to show him, and found him standing very still in the tack room doorway, face pale in a way that had nothing to do with his wound. Because standing just behind him, silhouetted against the fading afternoon light, was Cole Barrow. And beside Cole, unhurried, immaculate despite the long ride out from town, stood a man Addie had never seen up close before but recognized instantly, with the particular certainty of a body that remembers danger even when the mind hasn't caught up yet. Harlan Voss. He was older than she'd pictured. Silver at the temples, a face lined more by calculation than age, eyes that studied her, with an interest that felt uncomfortably personal, uncomfortably intimate, like a man examining something he believed he already owned. "Miss Doyle," he said. His voice matched the one she'd heard through the study door, smooth, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to get exactly what he wanted. "I've been waiting a long time to finally make your acquaintance properly. You've been watching me for a year," she said. "I wouldn't call that proper." Something flickered across his face. Amusement, maybe? Or the particular pleasure certain men take in being caught at something, and finding they don't mind the attention. "I prefer the word patient," he said. "You have your mother's tongue, you know. Sharp. Quick. She used to talk to me exactly like that." "Don't," Addie said. "Don't you dare talk about my mother." "Why not?" Voss said, taking a slow step forward, Cole and 2 more men fanning out behind him, boxing them into the ruined barn, with practiced, unhurried menace. "I loved her once. Genuinely. Whatever your father told you, whatever poison Mr. Cross here has been feeding you these past years, I loved your mother, before your father ever set foot in this county. And she didn't love you back." The amusement drained from his face entirely. "No," he said quietly. "She didn't. So you killed my father. 30 years later. Over a woman who chose someone else." "I killed your father," Voss said, voice hardening, "because he threatened to destroy everything I built. The land. The business. Everything I earned, with my own 2 hands after your mother made her choice, and I was left with nothing but ambition to keep me warm at night." His eyes flicked to the papers still clutched in her hand. "And I see you've found the reason he thought he had leverage over me. Older than the land dispute. I assume Mr. Cross has finally told you all of it." "It's not leverage," Addie said. "It's proof. You murdered a man for his money 15 years before that, and you murdered my father for his silence after." "Proof," Voss repeated, almost thoughtfully. Proof requires a courtroom, Miss Doyle. And courtrooms out here require judges. And judges, as I'm sure Mr. Cross has already explained to you, tend to owe me a great many favors. Nathaniel shifted slightly, his hand inching toward the pistol at his hip, and one of Voss's men swung his rifle sharply in warning. I wouldn't, Voss said mildly, not even bothering to look at Nathaniel directly. You're already bleeding, old man. Let's not make tonight messier than it needs to be. What do you want? Addie said. You could have burned this place to the ground, with us still in it. You didn't. Which means you want something. Voss's eyes returned to her, and something in his expression shifted, calculation giving way, briefly, to something almost like admiration. You really are your father's daughter, he said. He asked me the same question, once. Years ago, in Texas, right before everything fell apart between us. He paused. What I want, Miss Doyle, is quite simple. I want those papers. And I want your silence. Give me both, and I'll let you walk away, from this field the way you walked away, from it 8 years ago. Alive. And if I don't, then we'll simply finish what should have been finished the first time. The barn fell silent except for the wind moving, through the broken roof, through the tall grass outside, through 8 years of grief and rage that had finally, at long last, arrived at this exact moment, this exact field, this exact impossible choice. Addie looked down at the papers in her hand. Her father's careful notes. A dead widow's grief, preserved across 15 years, waiting for someone brave enough, or desperate enough to finally use it. And she thought of everything Nathaniel had told her. Every warning about rushing toward names, before understanding the shape of the thing behind them. She thought of her father's voice in the tall grass. Breathe out halfway. Then stop. No, she said. Voss's expression didn't change, exactly. But something behind his eyes went cold in a way that made the temperature of the whole barn seem to drop. No, he repeated. I'm not giving you these papers. And I'm not staying silent. Not after 8 years. Not after everything you've taken from me. Then you understand what happens next. I understand, Addie said, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out steady. Steadier than she felt. I understand that you've spent 30 years telling yourself a story, where you're the wrong man. Where my mother's choice justified everything that came after. Where a widow's grief, and my father's murder, and a year of men following me through Dodge City were all just collecting a debt. She lifted her chin. But you're not owed anything, Mr. Voss. You never were. You just couldn't stand losing. Something flashed across Voss's face, genuine fury, finally, cracking through 30 years of careful, polished composure. Take the papers, he said to Cole, voice tight. And finish this. What happened next happened fast. The way real violence always happens fast, faster than the mind can properly process, faster than fear has time to fully arrive, before it's already over. Cole moved first, lunging toward Addie, with his hand outstretched for the papers, and she stepped back, drawing her father's Colt in the same motion she'd practiced 1,000 nights in a dark rented room, and fired. Cole went down clutching his shoulder, screaming, the same shoulder Nathaniel had wounded weeks earlier now taking a second, worse hit. The barn erupted into chaos. Nathaniel, wounded as he was, managed to put a bullet into the nearest of Voss's remaining men, before a return shot caught him in the leg, dropping him hard against the tack room wall. Jesse, who never held a gun in his life beyond the one Nathaniel had insisted he carry for emergencies, fired wildly at the second man, missing twice before, on the third try, catching him in the arm, and sending him stumbling backward, through the barn door, into the fading daylight. Which left Addie and Voss alone amid the wreckage, smoke and dust hanging thick in the air, the papers still clutched tight in her free hand. Voss had drawn his own weapon somewhere in the chaos, a small, elegant pistol, the kind a man carries not for ranch work, but for exactly this kind of moment. It didn't have to end this way, he said, breathing hard, blood from a graze along his temple trickling down one side of his face. Yes, Addie said. It did. It always was going to end this way. You just didn't want to admit it. They stood there, 10 feet apart, in the ruins of the barn, where her father had once taught her to breathe out halfway, and then stop, 2 pistols raised, the whole weight of 30 years, and 8 years, and 1 torn shirt collapsing down, into a single, suspended moment. Your father had this same choice, Voss said quietly. Standing in a field very much like this one. He hesitated. Gave me time to have the last word instead of him. I'm not my father. No, Voss agreed. You're not. The next few seconds stretched impossibly long. Because Addie, standing there with her father's gun raised, and a murderer's blood already spilled around her feet, understood with sudden, total clarity that she had a choice neither her father, nor 8 years of grief had ever prepared her to actually make. She could kill him now. End it here, in this ruined barn, with nobody left standing, who could stop her, and no jury, no judge, no bought official, who could ever protect him from a bullet already halfway to its mark. Or she could do something harder. Put the gun down, she said. Surrender. Let a court decide what happens to you. Let the whole territory hear what you did, to the widow, to my father, to every family, whose land you stole. Let them see you exactly, as you are, not as some tragic man wronged by love. Voss stared at her. Genuinely surprised, for the first time all evening, his composure cracking, into something almost like confusion. You'd let me live, he said slowly. After everything. I'd let justice decide. Addie said. Not me. Not out of mercy for you. Out of respect for what my father actually believed in, before all of this took it from him. For one long, impossible moment it looked as though Voss might actually lower his weapon. Something moved behind his eyes, exhaustion, maybe, or the particular fatigue of a man who'd carried a 30-year grudge, so long he'd nearly forgotten what setting it down might feel like. Until his face hardened again, all at once, like a door slamming shut. No, he said. I don't think I will. And he raised his pistol. She didn't wait to find out what he intended to do with it. The shot rang out across the ruined farmyard, echoing off the leaning barn walls, scattering birds from the tall grass in every direction. Harlan Voss fell backward, into the dust, and this time, he did not get back up. The silence afterward was the loudest thing Addie had ever heard. She stood there, gun still raised, hands shaking now that there was finally room for them to shake, staring down at the man who had haunted 8 years of her life, without her ever once knowing his name. He looked smaller in death than he had in life. Which she supposed most men did. Addie. Nathaniel's voice, weak, urgent, pulled her back, into her own body. She turned to find him struggling to sit up against the tack room wall, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage around his leg, Jessie kneeling beside him trying, with limited success, to slow the bleeding. She crossed the barn floor in 3 quick strides, and dropped to her knees beside them both. We need a doctor, she said. Now. We need to get out of this county, Nathaniel corrected, wincing. Before whoever Voss left back in town realizes their employer isn't coming home tonight. What about them? Jessie asked, nodding toward Cole, still curled and moaning on the barn floor, and the 2 other men scattered unconscious, or fled into the darkness beyond. Cole talks, Addie said, standing, looking down at the man who'd torn her shirt in a saloon 3 weeks earlier, and set the whole impossible chain of events into motion. Cole's going to talk to whoever will listen, because Cole's not the kind of man who dies quiet for somebody else's secrets. Not when the man who was paying him is lying dead in the dirt. She was right. By the time a proper doctor and eventually a federal marshal from outside the county's reach arrived to sort through the wreckage of that night, Cole Barrow had already told them everything. The forged deeds. The murdered widow's husband, all those years back east. The year he'd spent watching Addie's every move at Voss's instruction, and the boy he'd paid to help him do it. The ambush outside the restaurant, planned days in advance, from nothing more than careful, patient observation. Every thread, finally, pulled loose and laid bare. The letter, and Sean Doyle's careful notes, did the rest. 3 weeks later, Dodge City looked almost exactly the way it had the night Addie's shirt tore in that crowded saloon. Same dust. Same noise. Same rhythm of cattlemen coming and going with pockets full of trail pay. Except everything had changed. Nathaniel heeled slow, but steady, walking with a cane now that he swore, loudly and often, was purely temporary. Jesse's story ran in 3 papers back east, under his own byline, the whole sordid tale of Voss land, and trust laid bare for anyone willing to read it, though he'd been careful, at Addie's quiet request, to leave certain details soft around the edges. Some things belonged to her alone. Addie herself stood outside the saloon on a cool October morning, the anniversary, nearly to the day, of the night her family's world had ended in fire and gunfire 8 years earlier. She wasn't hiding anymore. Everyone in Dodge City knew her real name now. Doyle. Daughter of a Texas Ranger who died trying to do the right thing in a world that rarely rewarded it. Some looked at her differently now, with pity sometimes, or awkward reverence, the way people look at anyone whose private grief has suddenly become public knowledge. She didn't mind it, as much as she'd expected to. Because for the first time in 8 years, she wasn't watching doors anymore. Wasn't counting exits. Wasn't flinching at every laugh that carried the wrong kind of edge. Nathaniel found her there, leaning on his cane, squinting against the morning light. "You look like a woman deciding something," he said. "I am. Care to share?" "I'm going back," she said. "To the farm. What's left of it. Not to hide from it anymore, and not to run from it either. Just to remember it properly, the way it should have been remembered all along. And this time, I'm not going alone." Nathaniel nodded slowly, something warm moving behind his tired eyes. "Your father would like that. I think he would too." 3 days later, she rode out to the Smoky Hill River country, this time with Nathaniel beside her, his legs still stiff, his cane traded temporarily for a saddle he insisted he could still manage, and Jesse trailing a little behind, with a wagon full of lumber he'd bought, without being asked, because some things a person simply decides for themselves, without waiting for permission. The wind cut cold and clean across land that had finally, after 8 long years, stopped feeling like a grave, and started feeling, cautiously, like something that might one day be home again. She stood along, while at the edge of the burned foundation, tall grass moving around her ankles, the sky stretching wide, and gray and endless in every direction, Nathaniel quiet at her side, Jesse already unloading boards from the wagon like a man who intended to start building before anyone gave him leave to. "I found it," she said quietly, to nobody, to the wind, to whatever remained of her father in a place like this. "Everything you were carrying. I found it, and I used it, and it's over now. It's finally over." The wind answered the way it always had, with nothing, and with everything, depending on how a person chose to listen. She thought of her father's voice, all those mornings in the tall grass. "Breathe out halfway. Then stop." She breathed. Let it go. And for the first time in 8 years, didn't feel the need to hold anything back. Because the debt had been paid. Not through vengeance, though vengeance had circled close enough to touch. But through truth, finally spoken out loud, in a courtroom, and in newspapers, and in the quiet, steady testimony of a woman who'd spent 8 years being told to stay silent, and had, at last, refused. Her father had taught her to shoot. Had taught her to track, to survive, to read a man's hands before his mouth. But the lesson that mattered most, she understood now, standing in the ruins of everything she'd once lost, with 2 men behind her already arguing cheerfully about where the new porch should face, was the one he'd never gotten the chance to say out loud. That surviving wasn't the same as living. And that some legacies aren't built from vengeance at all. They're built from the courage to stop running, and finally, at long last, come home.